Alright, I am back with another video, and today we're doing something very interesting. A build that I've been wanting to make for a long time is Marvel's Spider-Man. Now, but we're not doing this in the way that you might expect, because if I was building Peter Parker's Spider-Man, we would be building an Armour Artificer, because I actually think that's the best way to make the character. If we were building Miles Morales, I might do something with Storm Sorcerer for his Venom abilities. But no, we're not doing any of that today. Today we're going to be playing on the Spider-Verse. We're going to be creating our own completely new Spider-Man based on both Spider-Man's origin story and the lore of the Forgotten Realms to create a new Spider-Man kind of just existing in the Spider-Verse. So when I was kind of trying to figure out how to make this build, I didn't quite know exactly how I wanted to go about it, which is why I stepped away from it for the longest time. But once I kind of looked at how, mechanically, we're going to be getting Spider-Man's abilities through, like, our specific choice in leveling, I realised that the connection to the Underdark, and the Drow specifically, was very, very strong. Obviously, we have Lolth, the spider goddess, who is the matriarch patron of the Drow. You know, she is, like, what the entire Drow race could be based around. Like, most of the time, if they're Lolth sworn, it changes their very being. So I thought it would be interesting to tie the origins of Spider-Man to the Drow, especially when our abilities are literally going to be tied to the Underdark, as well as the fact that it's going to create a really nice and interesting origin story for our character, which I'll get into now. So, in Drow society, it's a matriarchal society. Women are considered to be at the very top rung, and men are basically slaves or something lesser. And I imagine that our character today, our Spider-Man, is at the very bottom rung of the ladder. Like, he is considered basically less than nothing. He is a slave, literally slaving away in his own civilization, probably just some sort of, basically the Drow equivalent of, like, a janitor who doesn't get paid, like, you know what I mean? And I think that in order to kind of begin Lolth's uprising into the overworld, to be able to start taking over, you know, Baldur's Gate and such like that, I believe a group of Drow matriarchs got together to perform some sort of alchemical arcane ritual. They got together, pulling in all of their magical powers given to them by Lolth, to create something new. This, like, alchemical arcane spider. Basically, they created this magical spider which they, you know, stored away for safekeeping. Now, this guy, in a funny twist, was basically doing his duties, you know, cleaning out maybe, like, you know, the arcane reserves or something like that, you know, just, you know, keeping everything tidy and all that, maybe some other things as well, maybe taking inventory, and I would imagine that this spider had escaped. Maybe it had some sort of its own abilities that the matriarchs didn't take into account when they made it, and as such, this guy gets bitten and gains the powers of the magical spider, giving him new abilities and such, like increased strength, you know, eventually spider-based powers like, you know, the classic webs and wall crawling and, like, the athletics and such as well. And that's basically the origin story for our Spider-Man. Once he realized he got these powers and accidentally the spider died in the process, the matriarch saw this as a grand betrayal and was set out to kill him. He basically fought his way out of the Underdark to the surface world, ended up near Baldur's Gate, and then got swallowed up by the Mind Flayer ship right at the start of BG3. So you're starting this game with a character, with a Spider-Man, who just got their powers and is learning how to use them. How good is that for a BG3 character? You've got a proper origin story that lines right up at the start of the game, and you actually get to see the character progress in a natural way as you level. I personally think this is a really cool idea, and it's going to make even more sense as we go throughout this build, and I show you the leveling scheme and what abilities we're going to be getting and how they tie into the Underdark. Trust me, you guys are gonna love this one. So, without further ado, after that very long intro, let's get into the build. We're going to kick things off as level 1 of Monk. I think the first thing that any Spider-Man realizes when they first get their powers is that they have enhanced strength and martial capability. So, we're going to be kicking this off with a level of Monk to give us unarmored defense, which we are going to be using, martial arts dexterous attacks to use our dexterity instead of strength, but we are going to be using strength with this build, and I'll explain why later. Also, our Death Strikes are going to give our unarmed damage a bit of a buff, and we're also going to get the ability to make a bonus action unarmed attack after we make an attack with our action using our Unarmed Strikes. So we're basically kind of getting extra attack, but it costs our bonus action to use. This is going to allow us to still be kind of like a proper martial, but we're going to be able to take our spellcaster dips very early on to get our spider abilities. So, moving on to the ability scores. Now, I think some people are immediately going to be seeing some things that they don't like, and I understand that, but hear me out. Strength is at 17, because yes, we are going to be bumping this up with Tavern Brawler. I think a lot of people who would want to make a Spider-Man build in this game do actually forget how much Spider-Man is very, very strong. Yes, his whole thing is being lithe and dexterous and, you know, swinging around and, being generally hard to hit, which makes sense for a high dexterity character, but Spider-Man can literally rip, like, a car in half without a second thought. He can lift an entire building. Like, this dude is insanely strong. And a huge part of Spider-Man's combat style is not just, punching and web shooting and all that. It's actually using his webs to grab objects and even other enemies and attack enemies with them. So, really, we want to be able to use a throwing attack playstyle with this build as well, being able to grab things in our environment and throw them at our enemies, or even throw other enemies themselves. It's actually a huge part of his kit that I think a lot of people completely miss out on, as well as the fact that strength is actually the stat that's tied to our jumping ability. So if we want to have, like, the ability to jump around as Spider-Man, getting into high up places, which is going to be important for this build's playstyle as we go, we need strength to do that, and Tavern Brawler obviously is going to make our offensive capabilities way higher than they normally would be. So it's doing so much for us that not having strength on this build just doesn't make sense. Now, if you wanted to take these points in strength and put them into dexterity and swap out Tavern Brawler for the athlete feat, then that actually also does make sense. It would free up our glove slot because, as you can see, we have a dexterity of 8, which means, yes, we are going to be using the gloves of dexterity in this build, which I know people don't like, but I'm sorry, this is just the way it had to work. But you could replace any glove. You could get like an unarmed damage glove. If you go the dexterity route, you could get the sparkle hands if you want some electrical style attacks for a bit more Miles Morales type deal. Like, you do have options available to you with this build if you don't want to go the Tavern Brawler route, if you don't care about being able to jump as easily as well as, being able to, throw things, then you don't need Tavern Brawler on this build. If you want to go for dexterity and have slightly more well-rounded stats, you could go down that route, but I am showing what I think is the most accurate way to build a proper Spider-Man, so this is what we're going with. So, dexterity is at 8, we're using the gloves of dex, so that's actually an 18. Constitution is at 14. I would like this a bit higher, but this character is not meant to be a frontline fighter. You're basically going to be supporting with ranged kind of support and control spells, like web, for example, from the back line, and then when you see that there's an enemy that's within your kill range, you can jump in, do a big flurry of blows attack, basically go full inoffensive, kill them, and then jump back out. That's kind of the game plan with this build. You're basically going to be supporting from long range with control and damage options, and then when you see the ability to go in for the kill, you dive in and do so. I mean, it's a bit like Spider-Man and Marvel Rivals now that I think about it, but that's just me. So basically what I'm saying is, you're not likely going to be in the front line of combat, so your constitution doesn't actually need to be that high for this build. Intelligence is at 8. Obviously, for any other Spider-Man, if we were playing Peter Parker, it would be incredibly wrong to have intelligence this low, but because this is our own Spider-Man, who probably didn't have exactly a formal education, we're going to say that intelligence at 8 is completely fine, as we don't need it. Wisdom is at 16. This is obviously going to be our main spellcasting stat, but we're not really using our spells for damage, more for control and support, so 16 is okay. You will perhaps have an opportunity to bump this up later if you feel like 16 is not performing as well, but just having this stat here for the whole build worked out fine in my testing, so I don't know, you'll have to play around with that one. And Charisma is at 10. We can't have Spider-Man without a little bit of Charisma. Unfortunately, we don't get Vicious Mockery on this build, sadly enough, but hey, maybe that's another Spider-Man build down the future, because again, we can make a lot of Spider-Man builds. The Spider-Verse is a thing. Moving on to skill proficiencies, I of course went with the folk hero background. I like to think that because this guy was so oppressed in his own society, coming up to the surface world and then being able to kind of go on the BG3 adventure would turn him into a hero type like the classic Spider-Man we know, working to save, people who are oppressed, working to, see justice throughout the land. I think he would be a genuine hero who wants to help people, to give other people a chance to, to have a hero that he never had, right? So I feel like it makes sense to go for folk hero with this and gain inspiration from helping others, because of course, Spider-Man is a hero at the end of the day, so I wanted to use it, but any background will work for this build. Athletics is going to be one of our skill proficiencies of choice because I do want strength-based shenanigans, and if you want to throw enemies, you actually do need to make an athletics check, so I wanted to make sure we had that at least. We're also going to get animal handling, which is going to be great for our wisdom score. This means that we're going to be able to succeed a lot of animal-based checks without the need for speak with animals, since our charisma is on the lower side. Insight as well. This is kind of my way of getting like a slight spider sense. Not really, it's mainly more about reading other people, but if we want to talk about spider sense, then we have perception for that as well. This is going to allow us to observe our environment and spot hidden details. We get this automatically as a drow, so again, the Spider-Man connection runs a little bit deeper than you might initially think, as well as we're going to be getting survival as well from folk hero. Of course, we are playing as a drow. This is going to gain its access to dancing lights, which you will never ever use, as well as proficiency with hand crossbows, rapiers, and short swords. Hand crossbow is going to be more relevant than you think. We're also going to get superior dark vision and fey ancestry, so overall I do think it makes sense. We are playing a Love-Sworn Drow today because again this man was born into a Love-Sworn society, and I do think a big part of his growth as a hero will be his struggle to overcome what is literally coded into his very being. So yes, you're going to be starting off as a Love-Sworn Drow, but as this character evolves, they will eventually become something greater. Right, so from level 2 onwards, you kind of have to choose how you want to level this build. Like I said, with level 1 of Monk, we pretty much have everything we want for like kind of the early game Monk stuff with that bonus action attack, so I don't think there's a huge need to go straight into level 2 of Monk. If you want more of the spider abilities that make Spider-Man, you're going to want to take our multi-class right away and go into Druid. I'll be showing off the Druid level first, and Druid levels first, I should say, and we'll go back into Monk a bit later. The reason I went with Druid is because it's one of the only classes that is wisdom-based, which is going to help our overall stats, that is also going to give us kind of everything we want for this build to help us make Spider-Man. So, first up, for our cantrips, obviously we're taking Thorn Whip. This is literally the web zip. We basically shoot out a web at an enemy, and they get pulled towards us. It's a shame that we can't really reflavor the animation in this sense, but hey, Thorn Whip is still going to do the job pretty goddamn well. And for our second cantrip, I would actually take Guidance here because it is very useful overall, and it might just help you be the face of the party a little bit more effectively. And by the way, I'm just going to say this now, yes, even though I do have mods installed on this character, this build itself is completely vanilla. We're not going to be touching the Mistress spells with this one. Moving on to our prepared spells, we do have a few options, but I do want to pick up the utility spells first. First up, Enhance Leap. This is going to triple our jumping distance, which we can just cast before we go into battle as a ritual, and basically just get this effect for free. This is going to allow us to traverse the rooftops of Baldur's Gate and anywhere we need to be, setting us up for our long-range support, and allowing us to dive in when necessary. We're also going to grab Long Strider to give us a bit more movement feet every long rest, which, movement feet, movement speed, every long rest. We're also going to be picking up Fairy Fire, as I do like the idea of this, like, Spider-Drow basically having an upgraded version of all of the Drow abilities. So we're going to be picking up as many Drow-based spells as we can to kind of basically not only give us the spider abilities, but also give us like an enhanced version of our racial abilities. So being able to cast Fairy Fire more than once per long rest feels very in line with this build. And your final spell can be whatever you want, it really doesn't matter. I would say you could take Fog Cloud for now, as it will fit into the general vibe of the build, but we will be swapping this out for something else later. Moving on to level 2 of Druid, this is where we're going to get a lot of the good stuff. We're going to be total level 3, so we're going to get Fairy Fire once per long rest from our race, as well as we're going to be able to choose our subclass, in which we are going with Circle of the Land. Circle of the Land is going to give us a ton of stuff to work with, but most importantly as well at level 2 of Druid, we're actually going to get the Spider Wild Shape. Yes, our version of Spider-Man can turn into an actual spider, because this thing, if used properly, is kind of strong. So basically what we're going to be able to do with the Wild Shape Spider is we're going to be able to emweb enemies. We can basically create webbed surfaces without the need for concentration like with the web spell. So what you can do is you can jump up onto a rooftop either before or at the very start of battle, turn into a spider and just starts throwing spider webs everywhere, keeping your enemies entrapped, allowing your allies to do whatever they need to do, maybe do some ranged attacks here and there. Basically, you'll have a massive amount of battlefield control. Also, as this build levels up, you'll have a decent amount of hit points by the end, so you'll have a little bit of extra tankiness with this if you do happen to catch a stray from like a ranged attack. It's pretty interesting, but we will basically also be able to use like a venomous poison attack, and by the time this build is done, you will actually have 3 attacks with your wild shape, 1 regular and 2 extra attacks, with the ability to still set up these webbed surfaces as a bonus action. So this can actually work well for kind of our diving idea as well. Dive in, do 3 attacks, throw out a web, get out. Like, you will have a lot of options, and with the other spells that we'll be able to concentrate on before we wild shape, this wild shape is going to have a lot of utility for us. And the idea of having our version of Spider-Man be able to turn into a literal giant spider to enhance his abilities just feels so fun. So we are actually going to be making use of the wild shape with this build. Moving on, we do get to choose another cantrip as a Circle of the Land Druid. Now, obviously, if you have the Mistress spell mod, you can pick up Primal Savagery, which has a spider as kind of like its thing, but honestly, let's just stick with what we know from the base game. I would say Resistance is another good cantrip to have in the off chances that it pops up. We don't really need any of the offensive cantrips here. Moving on, we do also get to choose another spell at this level, and Spider-Man does kind of have a healing factor, somewhat, not really. Having a bonus action healing word just to pop you up in case you ever need it is perfectly fine. Moving on to Druid level 3, we gain access to level 2 spells, as well as our Circle of the Land domain. For those of you that don't know, Circle of the Land allows you to pick a certain area of nature to draw more spells from. And of course, we're going for the Underdark to get not only Misty Step, which is going to feel very nice on this build for mobility, but also the web spell. The only way to get this spell as a druid, believe it or not. This allows us to, at the cost of our concentration, cover an area in thick, flammable webbing that slows creatures within, basically creating difficult terrain, and creates the enwebbed condition where they cannot move. Attack rolls against them will have advantage, and they attack with disadvantage, and they also have disadvantage on dexterity saving throws. It's a pretty nasty condition. So if we set up a bunch of webs either with our spider form or set up a web with this, we're going to be creating areas that are going to be really hard for our enemies to maneuver through. They're either going to have to go around or go through, being slower and risking getting trapped altogether. Honestly, it's a pretty fun thing. It's a shame, however, that it's concentration, though. That means it is going to conflict with some stuff that we're going to be getting later, but otherwise this is going to be our bread and butter kind of concentration spell that we're going to want to be focusing on, because with the goddamn Spider-Man. But again, also having Misty Step to just get us out of a nasty situation if we ever need to and we can't jump out is really nice. Overall, Underdark is a very nice kind of Circle of the Land domain. We also do get to choose our own level 2 spells from our kind of regular spell selection here. And I would say there's not really too much here, but I'd say it's overall very important to the build. You can kind of just get some nice options here. Pass Without Trace is a fun one if you want to set up kind of a stealth aspect to this character, which obviously Spider-Man does have, so being able to give your whole team stealth so you can kind of get set up and in position before a battle starts definitely does make sense, so I would recommend picking this one up. And purely for the lore reason, I do think protection from poison is something you could pick up on this build. Just cast it at the start of your long rest and get resistance to poison damage. Again, I kind of have my own headcanon that all drow like kind of have an innate resistance to poison because, you know, because most drow do work with poison very, very regularly, so it just kind of makes sense that they'd eventually build up a natural resistance to it. So in my personal opinion, protection from poison makes sense on this build, but of course you could also go for Hold Person here, which I'm actually going to be replacing Fog Cloud with. Hold Person is going to be my way of flavoring like the classic Spider-Man kind of web cocoon, where he'll web up an enemy so that they can't move. That's how I'm going to flavor this one, but of course this does also take our concentration, which means we'd have to choose between this and web. But web is great for covering an area, whereas Hold Person is good for locking down a single enemy, so you'll have to pick and choose in the moment. At Druid level 4, we're going to gain access to another cantrip. Again, it's a pick your favorite type situation. We kind of have everything that I would really want. So, I mean, you can kind of take Produce Flame if you want a blue flame on your arm, because it looks cool. We also do get the Darkness spell at this level. This is going to be another core component of our build, which I'll get to later. But basically, if we don't feel like Web is going to be a solid option, we can spend our concentration on Darkness to kind of put Darkness on our kind of sentry post, if we will, because again, we're going to be kind of at range for a lot of the battle, and so being able to cast Darkness on ourselves so that ranged attacks just cannot hit us, or being able to cast it into the battlefield and then we could dive in and be more of a frontline, like, kind of fighter, this will also work. You have a lot of different ways of using Darkness with this build, and we will have a way to use it more times than just once per long rest by the time we get to the end here. But this is going to be a very core component of the build as well. You'll have to choose between this and Web most of the time, but both will have their strengths and weaknesses. Overall, and again, being part of our innate Drow ability just feels kind of fun as well. But you'll also be able to synergize this with the Spider wild shape as well, being able to kind of like hide in the darkness while you're a spider and then still just be able to shoot out those webs without really having to worry about taking damage. So overall, Darkness is actually going to be very, very big for our playstyle. Moving on, we do get to choose another spell at this level. Again, it's entirely up to you, really, what you want to pick. We kind of have everything that I would honestly want from this level. So, I mean, you could go for Enhanced Ability for, like, a nice overall buff to certain ability checks if you need it. Moving on, we do get to get our first feat at this level, so of course we're going to go right away to Tavern Brawler and pick up that bump to our strength to round it out to a nice 18, and actually at this point, depending on your equipment, you might have it at 20, or if you want to go for the Potion of Everlasting Vigor to bump this up to a 20, you absolutely could. In fact, I would probably recommend it for this build if you don't care too much about exactly how you get that, but I think this character still would do that, especially by the kind of early Act 2 where you'll be able to do that. So yeah, definitely get the Potion of Everlasting Vigor on this build to completely max out the stat allocation here. Moving on to level 5 of Druid, we're going to get Wild Strike, allowing us to make an extra attack while wild-shaped. This version of extra attack stacks with normal extra attack, so when we eventually get our extra attack from Monk, that's how you're going to be making 3 attacks per turn while in wild shape. We're also going to gain access to level 3 spells and another Circle of the Land domain, in which we're going to choose Underdark again. No, we're not actually going to choose Underdark again, my mistake. Which one was it? Trying to remember here. I believe I went, yes, it is the mountain here. While you could go for Arctic actually to get haste, which actually, yes, no, sorry, I meant to get haste. Sorry, I actually made this build a while ago and I'm only recording the video now because I've had to delay it for a few days, so I kind of forgot what I picked and chose at the end of my testing. Yes, you do want to go with Arctic here to grab haste. Haste is going to be your fringe pick for a concentration spell. You're not actually going to be using this all the time because, believe it or not, you're going to get more value most of the time out of Darkness and Web. But haste is going to be when, like, you're kind of like, okay, we're up against a single kind of big boss character where, and I don't really want to just be focusing on Darkness, or the Web is just not really helping. Maybe you're up against something that's fire, or maybe that has, like, you know, the blind sight where Darkness doesn't affect them. So you're just going to be going in with haste and being able to go bam, 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 bam. Because haste is either going to give you 6 attacks with your wild shape, or like just a massive amount of attacks out of wild shape as well. So haste can really, really help. It's going to give you more armor class as well, and give you more movement speed to be able to dash around. It kind of feels like Spider-Man, like, actually starting to kind of recognize the full potential of his power. The reason I originally went with something like Mountain was because we got Lightning Bolt, which can take inspiration from Miles Morales, and Flight, which I almost kind of flavored as being like web swinging, and just giving you more maneuverability, but honestly, it's in practice, it's just kind of, you can kind of jump everywhere anyway, so why do you really need Flight? And also, it's something you'd have to, like, concentrate on as well, so it's not great. You can go for, like, Grassland if you want Haste and Daylight, but I don't see Daylight being very good. Overall, we don't really care about Sleet Storm here, but it can be useful, but I honestly don't think it's very much in character. And unfortunately, the Underdark one just isn't very good. Gaseous Form and Stinking Cloud just don't fit the build at all, and as such with none of the others either. So I definitely think Arctic is probably the best way to go. Grassland only really works if you're fighting vampires, because Daylight exists, I guess. I mean, you'd fuck up Morbius, but You can go with Arctic. Sleet Storm actually has some utility. But we also do get to pick level 3 spells at this point. And I kind of wanted to play into the idea of the superhero healing factor with this one. So you're going to be grabbing or Warden of Vitality. Basically, you can just cast this at the start of combat, doesn't cost you concentration, and every bonus action that you're not using to punch things, you can just restore Vitality and heal yourself a little bit. So you get that kind of superhero healing factor, which I feel like fits the build quite nicely. And we are done with Druid. You could technically go to level 6 of Druid for the Landstride difficult terrain ability. Because technically, even though we are going to have a way to prevent ourselves from being webbed up by our own webs, they will still count as difficult terrain for us. So unless you take the Ring of Free Action to stop that, which I actually don't on this build, because we're not really supposed to be standing in our own webs most of the time, we can normally jump out, you don't really need this ability, and I do think you don't really need the extra spell slot either, since our main focus is level 2 spells, so I actually think going for more levels in Monk does make sense for a 5-7 split as opposed to a 6-6 split, but there is a bit of freedom to play around there if you like. But moving on to level 2 of Monk, we're going to get Unarmed Movement, giving us a bit more movement speed while we're not wearing armor, which we are not. It's also going to give us the ability to dash as a bonus action, and disengage as a bonus action at the cost of key points, but our main thing here is Patient Defense. This is our first iteration of Spider Sense. As a bonus action and the cost for and a key point, we can make it so all attack rolls against us have disadvantage, and we have advantage on dexterity saving throws. Basically, we go into a heightened state of awareness where we can just dodge everything. It's Spider Sense, but we'll be building on this more a bit later. At Monk level 3, we get to choose our subclass. Now, I think 99% of people who would build Spider-Man would go for Way of the Open Hand here. Not only would you get the advanced martial arts of being able to augment your flurry of blows, later on, you'd also get, you know, the extra bonus action from wholeness of body and all that, and obviously the ability to add even more damage to your unarmed strikes, but I'm not here for that. Again, our Spider-Man is not the Spider-Man, it is our Spider-Man. Our Spider-Man that is built on the lore of the Drow. So we're going with Way of Shadow. Way of Shadow is going to give us a ton of interesting lore-friendly abilities for this build. Because again, not only is this spider giving us spider abilities, it's also enhancing our base racial abilities as well, turning us into a more powerful super soldier Drow. We're going to get the ability to hide as a bonus action, which feels kind of apt for Spider-Man anyway. It's also going to give us the ability to cast Pass Without Trace, Darkness, and Silence, all with key points, so a separate resource than our spell slots, allowing us to be slightly more resource efficient in that department. So not only are we getting more uses of darkness, but we just get all these other fun goodies as well. We also get Minor Illusion too, which can be useful. It's kind of like an advanced version of Dancing Lights, at least in my opinion, which can actually distract enemies. So overall, I feel like this just feels more in line with the build that we've created. It leans more into Spider-Man's stealth playstyle, which I can see why people might not necessarily want that, and would prefer to go Way of the Open Hand for some ass kicking, but the idea of being able to sneak up on an opponent in darkness, beat the ever-loving crap out of them, almost like a Batman-Spider-Man mix, and again, Spider-Man does do that too. I don't know, for this specific version of Spider-Man that we're building today, this just felt so right. So I don't know, I think Way of Shadow just feels so much nicer overall. At Monk level 4, we're going to gain access to Slow Fall. Unfortunately, we don't get Featherfall just in this build at all. You're going to need someone else to give you that, or get it from an item somehow. Otherwise, you're going to be taking half damage from a fall instead of no damage. But hey, half is still better than full. We also did get to choose another feat at this level. Now, this isn't like a meta powerful pick or anything like that. Really, you're probably going to want to take an ability score improvement here to either bump up your wisdom or your constitution, or maybe some sort of other feat. But come on, we're building Spider-Man here, and if we don't take alert, we're doing us a disservice. This is our Spider Sense at full power. We get a +5 bonus to initiative and cannot be surprised. I'm sorry, we're building Spider-Man, we're getting Spider Sense. Of course, like I said, there are other options available to you. Lucky also kind of feels in character for Spider-Man, but there's also a bunch of other things you could be grabbing as well. Obviously, if you're building the dexterity version of this, you would obviously take the athlete feat as well, so, you know, whatever you like. But I feel like Enhanced Sleep is good enough that we don't need athlete 99% of the time, so I'm happy to take alert here to bring our Spider Sense fully online. At monk level 5, we're going to be getting extra attacks, so now we just have more attacks in a turn. We're also going to be getting a stunning strike, which I like to flavor as like kind of like poisonous, like Lothian spider venom, like injecting itself into the enemy as you punch them, causing them to be stunned. I don't know, that's just kind of like a flavor thing, but stunning is obviously very, very powerful, so we want to make use of this. We're also going to get Cloak of Shadows, allowing us to turn invisible if we are obscured. One of Miles Morales' abilities is to turn invisible, so this actually feels very in line with a Spider-Man character to have, and again, fits perfectly with our kind of, like our Underdark background, so I just love this one here. And at monk level 6, we're going to be able to gain key empowered strikes, allowing our unarmed attacks to overcome resistance to non-magical damage. We're also going to get Shadow Step. Since we got Misty Step from the Underdark domain earlier, getting an advanced version of it in the form of Shadow Step, which kind of falls more in line with our Drow abilities, kind of also feels thematically accurate. We can teleport from shadow to shadow, and afterwards we have advantage on our next melee attack roll. And this doesn't cost any key points, so there's no resource cost to this other than a bonus action. So, as long as we're in our darkness cloud or in an area of shadow, and we've set up our darkness cloud somewhere, we can now teleport between it, meaning that we don't even need to technically use our jumping ability anymore unless we need to. So that Featherfall reliance isn't actually as you know, necessary as you would think. So Shadow Step feels right at home on this build. Now, the main reason I wanted to go to level 7 of Monk, not only is it going to give us an extra key point, but it's also going to give us Evasion, which feels so on point for a Spider-Man build. Basically, whenever a spell or effect would deal half damage on a successful dexterity saving throw, it deals no damage if you succeed, and only half damage if you fail. So now, our patient defense mixed with this, as well as, you know, alert and all that, our Spider Sense is now so strong that even Fireball technically can't damage us. We can dodge a fireball. You know, that just feels so on point for the character, but also, talking about the whole Spider-Man never gives up and is a hero type thing, we've got Stillness of Mind. If you are charmed or frightened, you automatically cast Stillness of Mind to remove the condition. Unfortunately, it does cost an action to use, but again, so if you're going to be inflicted by a damning spell effect that would cause you to turn on your allies or give up your heroic ways or just cause you to be so frightened you want to run away, you stay in the fight and never back down. I just had to take level 7 of Monk on this build, and I think now most of you see why. And that is the build. Overall, what you're going to be getting out of this is a really interesting gameplay loop. Basically, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be stealthing into combat, getting yourself and all of your allies into position. Then, when the time comes, you're going to be a long-range support character, setting up traps with things like web, darkness, maybe even hasting yourself. And then again, once your allies have taken a few enemies down a peg, you run in, or jump in, or teleport in even, take them down with a furious amount of attacks, you know, with things like flurry of blows and such like that, to take out a bunch of enemies, and then get back out to safety. Whether you're doing this as Spider-Man or the wild shape form, where you can kind of in-web or jump in and do a bunch of attacks. And remember, the web surfaces actually do nullify full damage as well, so if you jump into a web, you're actually going to be okay in that respect. Like, there's a lot of different ways you can go about this build. You've got a bit of self-sustain with a bit of healing, you know, you have the ability to be stealthy and hide if you need to, because again, we are a slightly squishy character, but our stealthy nature, being able to hide and turn invisible, is actually really going to help with that. And I do just think overall you're going to have a lot of maneuverability as well, with your massive amount of movement speed and movement options that you're going to have. You're just going to be able to do everything very, very well. You're going to be an effective support, an effective damage dealer, and again, you're going to have a lot of self-sustained self-healing, so you're just going to feel very, very, you know, you're going to be able to last long in battle, and you're going to be good kind of wherever you are in the battlefield. So overall, I really, really like this build. I feel like it captures the essence of Spider-Man perfectly, but not just trying to poorly recreate the Spider-Man that we all know and love. It's our own unique take on Spider-Man, which I absolutely love, that fits perfectly into BG3, and again is going to feel like a very satisfying narrative arc to go throughout the game. But of course, like any of my builds, they are enhanced by the equipment choice, so let's get into that now. First up, we obviously don't have a melee weapon on this build because we really don't need one. We want to be using our fists more than anything. Spider-Man doesn't really use weapons 99% of the time. However, I'm immediately going to ignore that rule and give him dual crossbows. But why? Well, the thing is Spider-Man uses web shooters that in most iterations. So while we don't get web shooters in this build, I've opted for regular shooters instead. Because at the end of the day, we are going to be spending a lot of our time at long range, setting up our important support stuff and waiting for the right chance to jump in. So with this, we can still do damage at range, being able to shoot our enemies with our dual crossbows, giving us up to 3 attacks at range as well. We don't have 2 weapon fighting on this build, so our offhand attacks aren't going to be as powerful, but the fact that they're pure force damage with the near misser is still going to feel really good. But we're also using the Hellfire hand crossbow to be able to use Scorching Ray shot, so if we want a bit of a fire attack we can, just beware that the burning condition will remove your webs, and again this can inflict burning while hitting a creature with this weapon while hiding or invisible, so we can inflict a burning status condition if we want to pretty easily with our setup. But this is mainly just here to give us a ranged damage option that we can use fairly consistently, and again, having dual crossbows to kind of like represent the web shooters, in my opinion, does feel like it makes some semblance of sense. Moving on though to the actual equipment, we have the Mask of Soul Perception. We're going to gain a +2 bonus to attack rolls, initiative rolls, and perception checks. Again, this is just here to kind of bump up our spider sense, but really anything can go in this slot. It really doesn't matter. You know, you could go for something like maybe, like, I don't know actually what I would really put in this slot. Maybe if you wanted the intelligence stat, you could put the headband of intelligence in there. You know, there's a few things you could put in this slot, but honestly, I think the Mask of Soul Perception just giving us all of these, like, passive buffs, just it works. I feel like it still fits within the realm of the Spider-Man, and I think it is the closest thing that this game has to a Spider-Man mask, if you're not using camp clothing like I have, so I do think it works quite well overall, so that's why it's my pick. But in the other game, you do have a couple of other options. The Haste Helm will give you momentum, which will give you more movement speed, and the Marksmanship Hat will give you a +1 bonus to ranged attack rolls and thrown attack rolls, so it's basically like a slightly diet version of the Mask of Soul Perception overall. Moving on, we do have the Cloak of Protection here. Again, where we are a bit squishy, I did want to have at least decent AC, and with the Cloak of Protection we can make our way up to 20 AC, and the +1 to saving throws is going to help with our concentration saving throws as well, again, if we do just so happen to catch a stray arrow here or there. Also, for our armor, we have the Vest of Soul Rejuvenation. Whenever the wearer succeeds a saving throw against a spell, they gain 1d4 hit points. So it gives us a little bit of healing, and again, if we're hit with spells that force us to make dexterity saving throws, we're going to make those very, very easily, so it's basically just free healing. Also, the wearer can use a reaction to make an unarmed strike against any attacker that misses, so if we are in a complete brawl with someone else, if they miss us with their attacks, which with all of our setup they're very much likely to, we just get a free extra attack against them, because again, we have 20 AC, if they're attacking us in darkness, they have disadvantage on the hit, we're basically just going to be getting free punches with our reaction all the time, which with Tavern Brawler is very, very strong. It's also going to give us a +2 to our armor class, so it is overall what I would recommend. But in the early game, you can go for the Mighty Cloth, which gives you Bull's Strength, which gives you advantage on strength checks, as well as increasing your strength score by 2 to a maximum of 20. You cannot be pushed against your will and have advantage on saving throws against being restrained. You also get the unique Bull Rush ability, allowing you to charge through enemies, possibly knocking them prone. I think this all fits in with Spider-Man kind of well. The Bull Rush can be reflavored as kind of like his web zip attack that he does where he like webs onto an enemy and then like pulls himself in for a punch. Very, very iconic move. But otherwise, this is kind of just here to give it you 20 strength if you want it, if you didn't take the Potion of Everlasting Vigor. But I recommend that you do take the Potion of Everlasting Vigor, because 20 strength is just something that this build would absolutely love to have. So I would definitely recommend picking that up in your playthrough. But overall, this is a very solid early game option for you. This or the Graceful Cloth if you're going the dexterity based route instead. Speaking of dexterity, the Gloves of Dexterity, setting our dexterity score to 18 and giving us a +1 to attack rolls. We kind of needed these for the build to work as I wanted it to, so this is just here by necessity. And finally, I can't remember the last time I used these, if at all. It might have been on the original Spider of Wrath build, but we have the Spider Step Boots. You are immune to being emwebbed, so we're not going to receive that very debilitating status condition from our own webs. And your movement speed is also not affected by web. surfaces. So yes, basically this just means that we can cast web either with our wild shape or our spell and not be affected by it when we run in and start jumping. Yeah. Like just jumping our enemies, I mean. So yeah, basically spider step boots, very, very niche pick, but basically required for this build, let's be real. So yeah, definitely want this here. But if you feel like you're not really getting the effects out of this, maybe you're not jumping into your own webs too much, which if you're not playing this build correctly, you could go for the Disintegrating Nightwalkers instead, but I do think this works pretty much essentially on this build. You just need this one, okay? Moving on, we've got this Spell Savant Amulet. This is going to give you an additional level 2 spell slot. This is more webs per long rest. However, if you want to swap this out for the Corvid token to give yourself Featherfall, that would also work, because that would also persist while wild shaped as well. So either this or the Corvid token, but probably this. I feel like the resource advantage you get from this is worth a bit more than the Featherfall, in my opinion. Again, we have a very solid amount of spell slots, despite only having 5 levels in our spellcaster of choice. Moving on, the Ring of Flinging. The wearer gains a 1d4 bonus to throw damage. This is again just kind of helping us, encouraging us to use that throwing playstyle, giving us a bit more damage when we do so. And finally, the Eversight Ring to make it so we cannot be blinded, so we can fight in our darkness completely unimpeded. However, I will note this: if you jump into darkness with the spider wild shape, you will still be blinded because the ring obviously does not apply while wild shaped. However, in my testing, this didn't actually seem to affect the playstyle very much, as the end web bonus action that you're going to be doing with the spider wild shape isn't actually affected by blindness because it's not an attack roll, so you're actually fine to just kind of shoot webs from the darkness with the wild shape if you want to, but just be warned that if you try to fight with the wild shape, you might be fighting at a slight disadvantage, literally, if you do so. So just be careful with that. But otherwise, this should play perfectly fine. Now, finally, the only modded aspect of this build, which is a rarity nowadays, is our camp clothing. I have gone for the Drow studded leather armor and the Drow leather boots from the Fear Tailor's camp clothing mod to give us the Drow look, as well as the Drow leather gloves. So we've got a full Drow armor, but I coloured it in the Saz Tam dye from the Faerunian Colours mod. Both of these mods are available on all platforms. This is giving us a Drow-inspired kind of Scarlet Spider look. Hey, you know what? That's what I'm going to name the build. Scarlet Spider. Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, so giving us this kind of black and red look. I did try to go for the classic red and blue. It didn't look good at all. It looked very, very garish, but there is a dye in the Faerunian Colours mod that will give you red and blue if you so desire, but I did think this looked better overall. I mean, obviously we are missing, like, the iconic mask, which I did kind of try to fix with face paint, but really, we're not really able to get that on this build, sad as it is. But yes, that is the build, and overall, this might be one of my favourite builds I've ever done. Not only do I think I've managed to accurately capture the essence of what is Spider-Man, my favourite hero of all time, it also is just a really fun build from a lore perspective. Combining the origin stories of Spider-Man with the lore of the Underdark just feels so cool, in my opinion. Not to mention the fact that we get so many cool and unique abilities that I never really get to showcase on many other builds. The web spell in particular being a really fun one that I just never get to use, because if I'm building a build, it's probably going to take other stuff than web, because there's just other stuff. But we get so many cool things here. It feels like all the pieces entwine into a really interesting and fun gameplay loop. I feel like it works amazingly as a team player. It supports the team as well as being able to deal massive damage. It's not selfish in any way. It plays really nicely. Obviously, though, I do have to point out the caveat here that unless you prepare your allies for it, darkness and in web can affect your allies as well. You do have to be a bit careful in that regard. You're going to have to be a bit strategic with how you place your webs. You're going to want to place your webs into choke points that the enemies are forced to come through to get to your team, that your team can then attack once they have suffered the necessary status conditions. In fact, you're probably going to want to play this with a team of characters that are effective at attacking at some sort of range, whether you've got a polearm master martial fighter that can attack from outside the normal range on the edge of the webs or something like that, or maybe like you've got like a sharpshooter archer ranger type character that you're pairing yourself up with. You know, maybe you can make some other Avengers. Maybe I'll finally get around to doing like that Tony Stark build that I've been thinking of doing, where he's like more arcane focused than machine focused. I don't know, like where he could just be blasting from a distance and flying everywhere. You know, we've got a lot of options. You will kind of have to think about how this build fits into your team composition in order to get the most out of it. Otherwise, you might find that you're stumbling upon yourself a little more than you originally intended to. But yeah, other than that, you've got a very, very solid build here. And in my solo testing, like, I would say the only real weakness that this build has was that if it did happen to catch a few big attacks, it does go down pretty quickly. But you do have so many tools to avoid that, between patient defense, the fact that you'll be able to start off really early in combat with the alert feat, so you can always set up before your enemies even have a chance. You can disengage and get out of combat really easily with the many options you have to either blind or disengage with Step of the Wind, you know, and then Web can just stop enemies from being able to chase you down outright. You do just have so many options, and again, you can go full frontal offensive, you can stealth away with invisibility and hide, you can go for haste and just go absolutely ham. Like, you've got so many different options, and that spider wild shape adds so much to the build, you have no idea. Like, again, being able to just perch yourself up on top of something, out of the way of the main combat, and just web, jump in, attack maybe 6 times with the hasted wild shape, and then could jump back out again. Like, it feels so fun. So feel free to play around with this one, really kind of get into the very different playstyle that it embodies, and once it clicks, you'll realize how cool this can be. So yeah, that is going to do it for me for today. I really hope you all enjoyed this build, as I had an absolute blast making it, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.